This has been a tragic case, and our thoughts remain with the family and friends of the two women who lost their lives.
A man being questioned on a double murder claimed it had all been an accident, but the evidence at the scene of the crime pointed to a cold, calculated plot. And the twists would keep coming long after the trial was concluded. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Hi, just let me take 10 seconds of your time to ask that if you are not already subscribed to Red Rum, please consider clicking that button. The more subscribers I get, the more content I can bring you. Thanks. On with the show. The quiet, beautiful village of Tilford, situated in the west of Surrey, became home to mother Christine Lee and two daughters Lucy and Stacey in the 1980s, following their escape from an abusive relationship. Tilford, near Farnham, is a really desirable residential area. It's got good access to London, and the village still has old world English charm and picturesque landscapes and countryside. 82-year-old John Lowe had lived at Keeper's Cottage all his life, and he didn't fit in with the Surrey stockbrokers around him. His Flintstone cottage was surrounded by acres of land and trees bordering a road, creating a sense of isolation. John's property was not only his home, but it was also a place where he built his livelihood of dog breeding. In 2004, John lost his licence for breeding because he was neglectful and cruel to his animals. He was visited by the RSPCA on a number of occasions, and after that, in 2005, he was given a fine and a 2-year disqualification. He was investigated again in 2008 and got an £11,000 fine and a 5-year disqualification. But this didn't really matter to John. He refused to give up, and he just continued breeding even though he wasn't allowed. John was known to be quite an aggressive person, and he once had a visit from the RSPCA and he shouted at them to leave, saying, "If I still had my guns, I would shoot you." Christine Lee met John Lowe after going to his property to buy a puppy. At the time, she was in the process of escaping an abusive relationship, and she'd started to rebuild her life with her children Lucy and Stacey. Christine's neighbours spoke about how friendly she was. She would always stop by for a chat, and she'd always take the time to say hello and get to know them. Christine's daughter Lucy often spent a lot of time with her mum. She was quite shy and quiet and reserved, but she was always the first to offer a helping hand. Stacey, however, had a bit of a different relationship with her mum. She would often stay away from her mum and her sister Lucy, and although they had a relationship, it was very on and off, and it would be through the next few years. One afternoon in 1986, Christine, Lucy and Stacey went to visit Keeper's Cottage, deciding that they wanted to buy a puppy, and that's where Christine first met John Lowe. While they were there, they also met John Lowe's housekeeper. Now, although John introduced Sue as his housekeeper, it became very clear later on that Sue wasn't his housekeeper at all. She might have looked after the house in part, but she was his partner, and by the end of the relationship, she'd been his partner for 17 years. But at this point, when Christine came to the house to buy that puppy, John and Sue's relationship was very much still alive. However, Christine and John felt a spark from the moment they met. There was something that John really liked about Christine. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he really was attracted to her, and he wasn't prepared for this puppy dealing to be the only interaction they had. The pair started a relationship, and as a way of moving away from her previous abusive relationship, she decided very early on to move in with John. She moved herself and her two daughters into Keeper's Cottage. The arrangement was that although Sue did know about the relationship going on between Christine and John, she didn't seem to mind. In fact, she was incredibly caring and sensitive towards the two younger girls, and she was quite happy to have them live with her. Christine used this Keeper's Cottage as a sort of safe space for her and her girls to escape the relationship that she'd just come from, where there was domestic violence. However, things went downhill quite quickly with John, and he also began hitting Christine. She was later quoted as saying, "He could be incredibly kind, he could be incredibly funny. Yes, he hit us, but it wasn't like what we experienced before." As charming as Christine thought John was, he could also be incredibly immature. And ultimately he was difficult to live with, so eventually Lucy and Stacey, when they were old enough, moved out and they moved away from home. And it wasn't long after that Christine actually decided to move out. She got her own place and she moved in there. But then, in 2012, completely by coincidence, Christine and John ran into each other. John broke the news to Christine that his housekeeper or partner, Sue, was suffering from dementia and it was deteriorating, and he was finding it really hard to care for her. Christine went home that evening and she told her daughter Stacey this, and Stacey, on hearing this, thought that she might be able to help, and so she actually went back round to John's house and said that she would help care for Sue. She said Sue had been so kind and welcoming all those years ago that it was the least she could do in helping her in the last few years of her life. Sadly, Sue died in 2013, but Stacey, who had been living there and caring for her, was also using that time to look after the dogs that John had kept on his property. And so she'd said that she would stay away for a little longer at John's house and she would continue to help care for the dogs. Stacey told John she didn't like the way that he was looking after the dogs and the way that he was continuously breeding them, and that he should stop. Now, he was committing a criminal offence given his previous interactions with the RSPCA, and he was extremely neglectful towards the dogs, but John told Stacey he didn't care about her opinion and he was going to continue doing what he wanted. And then, one afternoon, when Stacey was in the kitchen doing some washing up, she heard John come inside the kitchen and stand behind her. When she turned around, she saw that he was holding a shotgun and he was aiming it at her. Now, this caused her to panic, of course, and she ran out of the house, and John shouted after her that she should stay away and never come back. She would later say, quote, "He said he was going to blow my head off, so I ran away. I ran for my life." Stacey called the police and reported what had happened in John's kitchen, and as a result of this, an investigation was started, and the police went round to John's house and they told him what had been alleged. And when the police were in John's house, they saw that he had a cabinet full of guns, and so as part of this investigation, they confiscated all of his guns. Now, John completely denied that any of that had happened, and as a result of there not being any evidence and they couldn't convict him or press charges any further, they decided to stop the investigation there. And puzzlingly, after that, Stacey actually said that she didn't support the prosecution of John, and so he was given all of his firearms back. Following that, Stacey did not return to the puppy farm or to Keeper's Cottage, but her sister Lucy and her mum Christine did, so that they could help out with the puppy farm. The woman would continue to visit sometimes up to 4 times a week, and they said that they had to do this because without them helping, there would have been no way that John would have been able to continue working in the way he used to. By this point, he was becoming older and frail. After Sue's death, he had really begun to deteriorate, and in 2014 he was found to be malnourished and that he wasn't able to look after himself properly. He was in a very financially unstable position, and it came to light that Christine and Lucy were the only ones who really cared for him. He didn't have any family or friends left. The 23rd of February started off like any other normal day, with Christine and Lucy making their way round to Keeper's Cottage to continue their care for John. However, from what we know, the situation at Keeper's Cottage went downhill pretty quickly as the day went on. First, Lucy called her boyfriend Matthew and told him that John had asked for the keys to the gun cabinet. Matthew would later tell police that, quote, "She was not calm, somewhere in the middle, slightly stressed, and she asked me to pick her up from the cottage and take her home. She was concerned about letting him have access to the gun cabinet. She thought it was perhaps not safe to let him have the keys with her and her mother around. She felt that it would be a threat to her and her mother." Matthew agreed to pick Lucy up a little later at 3 p.m, and he said that he could overhear John in the background, and he was aggressive, but at that point he wasn't overly concerned. Not long after that conversation had ended, John did manage to get the key to the gun cabinet, and he opened it and retrieved one of the shotguns. He walked into the living room of Keeper's Cottage and he turned and faced Christine, who was standing there. He aimed the shotgun at her, walked closer to her, and then shot her at almost point-blank range. Lucy saw this and she ran outside screaming and called for help.
Emergency service. Right, my mother's just been shot. Keeper's Cottage shut. My mother's just been shot. Keeper's Cottage shut. Keeper's Cottage shut. Right, I need the police to come to Keeper's Cottage shut. I'm running for my life. He's just shot my mum, John Lowe. I don't know if I'm going to be alive if I go back in there.
As you can hear, Lucy says that John has shot her mum and she went out, she was running for her life. And after that, knowing she'd given the police all of the information she could, she went back inside the house. She didn't know what we now know, in that there was no saving her mum. John had pretty much killed her straight away. As soon as she returned to the house, John shot her immediately and then a moment later shot her again, killing her. Shortly after the shooting, a police helicopter was dispatched to the scene of the crime. The helicopter captured footage of police arriving at the cottage and finding the bodies of Christine and Lucy, as well as a dog that John had shot during his killing frenzy. The police continued searching and went on to find another 3 dogs that John had shot and killed in their kennels. As the police approached John, he said, quote, "They have been giving me shit for weeks." John went on to admit that he had shot both Christine and Lucy, and so he was arrested and taken to Guildford Police Station. When John got there, he showed no remorse, saying that, quote, "This might sound terrible to outsiders what happened here, but I can assure you that nothing else could be done," adding that his intention was to put the 4 dogs down, so he had taken 4 cartridges, 1 for each dog, loaded 1 in each barrel of the gun and put 2 in his pocket. But he also said that the women needed to be, quote, "put down." John also said that his housekeeper, also known as his partner, Sue Wilson, had died a matter of months ago, and her bank account had been emptied of £350,000. By process of elimination, John pinned his accusations of the stolen money on Lucy and Christine. Quote, "I'm not sorry I'm out of the problem. They were causing me problems every day. I've had terrible problems with Christine. They wouldn't let me eat. I'm glad the torment is over with these people. I couldn't take it anymore. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but I'm glad these 2 people are out of my life. They've been giving me a terrible time." He went on to admit another part in his murder plan that eventually he decided against, and that was to do with Lucy's sister, Christine's other daughter, Stacey Banner. Quote, "I didn't want to get in shit over her, but she had 2 young kids, otherwise I'd have sorted her out. Stacey Banner's her name. Stacey is the sister of Lucy who went today. Christine Lee is an ex-girlfriend who's supposed to be looking after me, but is starving me to death, and she's been keeping me short of money. I have to beg for petrol money. They were driving me mad every day. They were giving me a terrible time. All the relief has gone off my shoulders. It was terrible morning, noon and night."
I only got the gun this morning because I was going to put 4 dogs down. I came in the dining room with a gun, and Lucy started shouting at me, "What are you going to do with the gun? What are you going to do with the gun?" I had no intention really of putting that there. I was going through the door, holding the gun up to go through the door. They were both barraging me in front of me, barricading me. I pulled the trigger, I don't think I even meant to. And that killed John.
But of course later, John would go on to try and rationalise his actions, saying that he had only ever loaded the gun to kill his 4 dogs, and the guns had gone off by accident when it came to Lucy and Christine. Ultimately, the case went to trial. Now, John's version of events did not exactly match up with what the forensics had found at the scene of the crime. John claimed that his double-barreled shotgun had gone off by accident. He said he was walking through the kitchen with the gun, and Christine and Lucy were arguing about feeding times of the dogs. Now, John said he'd had enough of this and was going to go and shoot the 4 dogs so there'd be no more arguments. He walked towards the back door but found it had been locked, and the lock was something that Christine had put on and only she had the keys. So he said he went into the living room and through there towards the conservatory doors so he could get out that way. Now, as he did this, he said that Christine and Lucy, who were sat at the table by this point, stood up and started shouting at him. He was asked if he told them what he was doing, and he replied that he didn't get a chance. He said Christine had come up to him and demanded the gun, which he'd refused, and with that she'd grabbed the barrel of the shotgun and then it had accidentally gone off. He said his finger was on the trigger and it just accidentally pulled backwards and went off. Now, John had an excellent knowledge of guns, and he went on to also say that he knew that it was stupid. He knows never to walk with a gun loaded indoors, but for some reason that day he did that. He was asked if he meant to pull the trigger and he responded that no, of course he didn't mean to. Then he said that he turned around and the gun just accidentally went off all over again. He said that this must have been because of the flimsy way he was holding it. With Christine lying on the floor just moments away from death, Lucy ran out of the conservatory doors, along past the front of the house, and that's when she made the call to 999. John claimed at this point that he thought, oh, quote, "Thank Christ she's not been hit," referring to Lucy. A few moments later, he said that Lucy returned into the house and she had blood on her hands and her face. And John says she then went back round the side of the house and sat on the steps outside. At this point in his evidence that he was giving, John made quite an extraordinary claim. He said, as he stepped away, the gun went off by accident again. Now, he says he assumed that it had missed Lucy and so just left her there whilst he went to go and find the dogs. When the police arrived, John claimed that he tried to shoot himself, but the trigger, quote, just clicked and it didn't go off. The firearms expert gave evidence that showed that this had been a purposeful act. Quote, "You don't just touch it and it goes off, you have to physically pull it back." The prosecution did ask for a minimum 30-year sentence, and John was ultimately convicted and he was given 25 years. And at this point, John was 82, so he would be spending the rest of his life in prison. But that wasn't the end of the case. At the beginning, I did say this had a couple of twists and turns, and this is one of them. It was reported in 2014 in the Irish Mirror that John Lowe had previously tried to hire a hitman to take out his housekeeper/wife/partner, Sue Lewis. In 1997, John had asked a person he knew, someone called Paddy Booker, if he would be able to kill Sue Lewis. Now, Paddy said no. He also was a police informant, and so he let the police know about this. And when he let them know, they said that they would look into it further, but ultimately nothing happened. The police said they took his claim serious, but they weren't going to arrest John. However, they would keep an eye on him. After the double murder, Paddy said, quote, "When I heard he'd been arrested for murder, I contacted Surrey Police to make them aware of my previous warning and spoke to a case officer. I was told that someone would take a statement from me, but it hasn't happened. I find that extraordinary." And that is not even where the case ends. There is one more development in this truly unbelievable story. In March of 2017, Christine's other daughter, Stacey Banner, was arrested and convicted of fraud against Sue Lewis. After Sue had taken Stacey into her home, she had over £100,000 fraudulently taken from her bank account. This happened while Stacey was apparently selflessly looking after Sue through her declining health in 2013. This was the same year that John threatened her with a gun, which led to temporary confiscation of all of his firearms. Remember that Stacey mysteriously withdrew her complaint against him, which ultimately led to him getting the guns back. Stacey was charged with fraud jointly with John, which means that John was working with Stacey to try and cheat Sue out of all of her money. The prosecution of John on this case wasn't actually taken any further because he was already in prison and would likely die there. But Stacey was prosecuted and she was convicted of 5 counts of fraud totaling over £107,000. During the trial, the jury were told that both Stacey and John had withdrawn that money from Sue's bank account. They were able to do this because Sue was in no mental state to make financial decisions because of her dementia. They told the bank that the money was needed for urgent repairs to Keeper's Cottage, and that if they didn't make those repairs, then Sue would have to go into a care home. But only a fraction of the £107,000 was actually used to help do up the cottage and make it comfortable for Sue to live in. The rest of the money disappeared. This may well have been what the pair were arguing about on that day when John ended up threatening Stacey with that gun. Back in prison, John's health started to deteriorate, and meanwhile, back at Keeper's Cottage, things started to fall into disrepair, and urban explorers went to the now deserted and derelict cottage and filmed themselves walking around the scene of the Puppy Farm murders. A few personal possessions were scattered around, which added to the feeling of this place being left to rot after the tragedy. Although a couple of sofas and chairs still stood in the kitchen and conservatory, multiple windows were smashed and the rest of the fittings were stripped. In 2018, double murderer John Lowe died in prison of bone marrow cancer 4 years after he was sentenced to life in prison. Since his death, permission has been granted for the demolition of Keeper's Cottage and the surrounding area, and a new 5-bedroom luxury property with a swimming pool is going to be built in its place. That development is a far cry from the Keeper's Cottage that John kept, lived in, and ultimately murdered 2 women, Lucy Lee and her mother, Christine Lee. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Red Rum. Please click the thumbs up button if you liked it. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our newest YouTube members. We've got 2 of you now, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. It really, really means the world to me, so thank you. Oh, and don't forget, you can find Red Rum on Instagram at Red Rum True Crime, and also on Twitter and Facebook. Come and say hi over there. And other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.